Dr. Wessner, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Just to remind people who don't know who you are one of our child and adolescent, adult psychiatrists, and pediatricians who also happens to be board certified in obesity medicine. You're a regional medical director of the West and based in Colorado. In the literature and in the lay public, there's actually been a lot of excitement and a lot of discussion around a new way of looking at how to measure someone's body to determine if they're potentially at risk for health complications. It's a new metric called the BRI, the Body Round Index, which is a potential replacement or maybe an adjunct to something we've been using for many years called the BMI, or the Body Mass Index. And there was recently an article in the Huff Post that you were quoted on, along with several of our other colleagues in the eating disorder world. So I really wanted to kind of understand, the approach and the concerns that we're having, especially from the eating disorder world, as well as we think about this in the general population and health. And I think it's also really interesting that they reached out to you because of your area of expertise in eating disorders and obesity medicine. Can you explain a little bit about why this is coming up and kind of why people are getting excited, and excited in the sense of positive, and some people actually excited in the sense of, hey, wait a minute, there's some concerns about this measure as well?
Yeah, the BRI is Body Roundness Index. It's a new measurement that takes anthropomorphic data. So it takes some measurements of your central part of your body and your height and puts it into a very complicated calculation and gives you a number that some very smart statistics people have looked at the correlation of that number and all-cause mortality.
So is the BRI similar to what I'm pretty familiar with because I see it all the time, the BMI, the body mass index, which I believe is just it's a calculation, but it's just based off of your height and your weight.
That's exactly right. In that way, it is similar. It is a calculation based on a couple of data numbers without any other information about who you are or how you came to be in that place, your
Mhm.
age, your pregnancy status, which can very much impact your central measurements. So it is a number.
Right. So it's a way to get a snapshot, but it may not necessarily truly describe, why that snapshot looks that way in the current moment.
Exactly, exactly.
One of the things that people talk about, like with the BMI, is that it's not always accurate because someone may be very muscular but short, for instance, and then therefore, according to the BMI, they might be considered obese or overweight. And is the idea that the BRI, because it's a different calculation, may account for some of that, of not just height, but it's talking about true, not muscle and fat, and that's why they're doing the adipose kind of around the waist and the circumference area?
Yeah, so like you said, BMI looks at overall body size and then makes correlative assumptions based on body size that we have been able to identify some shortcomings with. BRI calculates the measurement of just the central part of the body, which tends to be less muscular and does tend to have more adipose tissue. And we know that when you have adipose tissue in the central part of your body, it is often associated with more inflammation and disease, which could be connected to a shortened lifespan.
So when we look at things like BMI and BRI, what I hear you saying is one of the key things is we take these measurements, and when we look at it from a population standpoint, meaning thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, we can make correlations to outcomes like mortality or morbidity, like is someone going to die early or develop certain diseases, diabetes, strokes, things like that. But these measurements, you have to bring them all together to look at a very large population to get trends, but that may not mean that just because I have a certain measurement, be it a BMI or a BRI, I may not be able to tell what that specifically means for me as an individual. Is that
That
accurate?
That's exactly right. And I think the danger with these sorts of articles and these sorts of calculations is that people want to be able to take their own measurements, put it in, and make an assumption about themselves and their risk, but then also use that piece of information to change their risk. So in this case, BRI, people may be under the mistaken impression that if they make their midsection smaller, they will decrease their mortality risk. We actually don't know that. This
Mhm.
data didn't show anything about how to change mortality risk. It only showed that, to your point, in tens of thousands of people, there was some correlative data about mortality and central adiposity.
So would a fair kind of comparison be like, I always think about, gosh, I've got to go get my cholesterol checked or my lipids checked. And so I make the assumption that if my cholesterol or my lipid level is a certain thing and I take a medication or do things to reduce that, then that means I'm actually safe and better. Is that really true?
That's the part that we don't know. And that's, I think, one of the risks is that we are all steeped in diet culture and the idea that when we are thinner, we are necessarily healthier. We know that that's not necessarily true. And especially in the work with people with severe eating disorders, we know that there can be really tragic outcomes to make that assumption. One of the important things to note about the BRI article that's in the data, if you go to the actual literature, is that this was a bit of a bell curve. So people at the lowest and the highest end of the BRI calculation had increased mortality. The safest place was in the middle. And people forget that BMI data actually shows the same thing. People at the lowest and the highest ends of BMI have the highest mortality risk. People that actually live in the middle spaces have the lowest mortality risks. So I think that it is important to note the assumption that if you decrease your BRI, you're making yourself healthier. We just don't know that to be true. And we know that the risk of falling victim to diet culture, where if you make yourself thinner, you will necessarily be healthier, has other very significant risks.
So, Dr. Wassner, what I hear you saying is while this is a potentially useful new way of having more information that may help us make some correlations, and especially in general population health, we also have to always be very careful that we're not over interpreting and trying to use that to make a lot of assumptions, especially when it comes to issues around body image, which may lead us to have behaviors or engage in activities that can have a negative consequence for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. My gut reaction to this article was that this is likely to contribute to some negative experiences of weight stigma and diet culture that many people experience, especially in medicine. And so I think that it is so important that we find ways to temper that. It is important to gather data. As a population, it's important to keep wondering and being curious about how we can be healthier and have more fulfilled lives, but not fall victim to the reductionistic ideas of weight stigma and diet culture. And for individuals who are seeking medical care, I worry that this particular article, this particular calculation could reinforce the idea that something with their body is wrong rather than they're not able to live the life that they want. And how can we help them to achieve their health goals as it relates to the life they want to live?
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.